For decades, Steve Harvey has made millions of people laugh. But behind that famous mustache and unforgettable smile, 69 has brought a side of his life that feels very different. In June 2026, Harvey revealed a deeply personal family loss involving someone he had come to regard as far more than a father-in-law. And while the cameras keep rolling and Family Feud continues, there are moments when even Steve Harvey's trademark humor cannot hide what he is feeling. But this story goes far beyond one heartbreaking goodbye. The deeper you look into Harvey's life, the more you realize just how much he has already endured, and what this latest loss may have forced him to confront. Long before millions of people knew him as the sharply dressed host of Family Feud, Steve Harvey was simply a kid from Cleveland with a dream that sounded almost impossible. Born Broderick Stephen Harvey in Welch, West Virginia, on January 17, 1957, Steve was the son of Jesse Harvey, a coal miner, and Eloise Vera Harvey, a Sunday school teacher. His family eventually moved to Cleveland, Ohio, where Harvey grew up in a household that did not have much money, but did have something he would carry with him for the rest of his life: faith, family, and an insistence that he should believe in himself. Even as a child, Harvey was already thinking beyond the circumstances around him. According to his official biography, he knew from a young age that he wanted to be on television. But there was an obstacle that could have easily convinced another child to give up. Harvey struggled with a severe stutter. Imagine that for a moment. A boy who dreamed of speaking to millions of people had difficulty getting his own words out. Yet instead of allowing that obstacle to define him, Harvey kept moving forward. That determination would eventually become one of the central themes of his entire life. He would later build much of his public philosophy around the idea that people have to dream beyond what their current circumstances seem to allow. After high school, Harvey attended college but did not complete a degree. His early adult years were anything but glamorous. Before becoming a household name, he worked a collection of jobs, including insurance sales and postal work, and even explored boxing. None of those paths seemed to be the answer. Then came comedy. In 1985, Harvey stepped onto a stage at an open mic comedy night in Cleveland. That performance changed the direction of his life. He discovered that the thing that had once seemed like a weakness, standing in front of people and speaking, could actually become his greatest strength. But finding his calling did not mean finding immediate success. Quite the opposite. Harvey spent years performing in clubs and trying to build a career while dealing with the kind of financial uncertainty that most people never see once a celebrity becomes famous. The road became so difficult that he eventually experienced homelessness. He has spoken about living in his car during those years, traveling from performance to performance and taking whatever opportunities he could find. This is one of the most important parts of Harvey's story because it completely changes the way his later success looks. When viewers see the expensive suits, the television sets, the packed theaters, the luxury lifestyle, and the confident man standing behind the Family Feud podium, it is easy to imagine that success was always waiting for him. It wasn't. There was a period when Harvey had no guarantee that the next performance would lead anywhere. There was no certainty that Hollywood would notice him. There was no promise that the dream he had carried since childhood would ever become reality. There was simply the decision to keep going. And eventually, something happened. In 1990, Harvey won a national comedy competition, helping lead to his breakthrough appearance on Showtime at the Apollo. From there, the doors began opening. His comedy career grew. Television followed. Then came the Steve Harvey Show, film appearances, radio, books, and eventually the position that would introduce him to an entirely new generation, host of Family Feud. Harvey had gone from sleeping in a car to becoming one of the most recognizable faces in American television. But there was something else happening beneath that success. The man who had once fought simply to survive was becoming increasingly focused on what success actually meant. Harvey did not just want money or fame. He repeatedly spoke about faith, purpose, family, mentorship, and helping other people recognize their own potential. His official biography describes his family as his proudest accomplishment, and he and Marjorie Harvey have built philanthropic programs focused on mentoring and helping young people. That matters because when you understand where Steve Harvey came from, you begin to understand why family has always occupied such an important place in his world. The laughter became his profession. But family became part of his identity. And after decades of fighting his way from obscurity to superstardom, Harvey eventually reached another major turning point. He began stepping away from the stage that had made him famous. In 2012, he performed what he described as his final stand-up show at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, bringing a 27-year stand-up career to an end. That decision might have looked like the end of one chapter. In reality, it was the beginning of another. Because Steve Harvey was no longer simply a comedian trying to make people laugh. He was becoming a husband, father, grandfather, businessman, mentor, and one of television's most recognizable personalities. And eventually, those roles would collide with something success cannot prevent: time. Because while Harvey was building an empire and creating a legacy, the people closest to him were growing older too. And one of those people would eventually leave a hole in the Harvey family that money, fame, and television could never fill. By the time Steve Harvey became a household name, the struggle that had once defined his life had almost disappeared from view. Audiences saw the polished suits. They saw the mustache, the booming laugh, the perfectly timed reactions, and the man who seemed completely comfortable standing in front of millions of people. But behind that confidence was someone who had spent years learning how quickly everything could disappear. That lesson would become especially important as Harvey moved from stand-up comedy into television. His breakthrough had come through comedy, but television eventually gave him something stand-up could not: longevity. Harvey starred in The Steve Harvey Show, hosted Showtime at the Apollo, built a radio career, appeared in movies, wrote best-selling books, and eventually became one of the most recognizable hosts in the country. And then came Family Feud. Harvey began hosting the long-running game show in 2010, and the job became one of the defining roles of his career. His reaction to contestants, his improvisational humor, and his willingness to say exactly what viewers at home were probably thinking turned ordinary answers into television moments. According to Harvey's official biography, the show experienced record-high ratings during his tenure, and he eventually surpassed Richard Dawson as the longest-serving host in the program's history. Suddenly, the comedian who had once been fighting for a place on a stage was sitting behind one of television's most famous podiums. But success has a strange way of changing the questions you ask yourself. When you're young and struggling, the goal is survival. Get the next job. Get the next performance. Pay the next bill. Keep the dream alive. But once you have achieved the things you spent decades chasing, another question starts to appear. What now? Harvey had already answered that question in one very significant way. He decided that stand-up comedy no longer had to be the center of his life. On August 2, 2012, he performed what he described as his final stand-up show at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas, ending a 27-year career as a stand-up comedian. For another comedian, retirement from stand-up might have meant slowing down. For Steve Harvey, it almost seemed to mean making room for something bigger: television, business, philanthropy, mentorship, and most importantly, family. Harvey and his wife, Marjorie, have built a large blended family, and their official biography describes their 7 children and 7 grandchildren as Harvey's proudest accomplishment. Together, the couple also founded the Steve and Marjorie Harvey Foundation, which focuses on mentoring and providing opportunities for young people and families. That detail is easy to overlook when discussing a celebrity whose career has been so enormous. But it explains something about the man audiences see today. Steve Harvey isn't simply trying to remain famous. He's trying to leave something behind. His business empire grew as well. In 2017, he launched Steve Harvey Global, bringing his various businesses under one organization and expanding into production, digital content, television, film, and international entertainment. The company even became involved in producing Family Feud internationally, including Family Feud Africa. The irony is almost impossible to miss. The man who once had almost nothing eventually built a world around himself that included television, radio, publishing, production, business, philanthropy, and global entertainment. Yet none of those things could change one basic truth. Steve Harvey was getting older, and so were the people he loved. That reality can hit differently when someone has spent most of his life moving forward. Harvey's career was built around motion. One opportunity led to another. One television show led to another. One business became another. One success opened another door. But life doesn't move at the same speed as a career. People age. Children become adults. Parents become grandparents. And eventually, the generation that helped shape you begins to disappear. For Harvey, family has never been just a talking point. His own official website repeatedly returns to faith, family, gratitude, and perseverance as central parts of his story. Even when discussing his career, he connects success back to the people and values that helped him survive the difficult years. That's why the next chapter of his story feels so different. Because this isn't about a failed television show. It isn't about a canceled project. It isn't about losing money. It isn't even about stepping away from the spotlight. It's about something fame cannot negotiate with: loss. In June 2026, Steve Harvey faced the death of his father-in-law, James A. Bridges Sr., who was 91 years old. Harvey publicly remembered him as Pop Bridges, a name that says far more about their relationship than the formal title of father-in-law ever could. And suddenly, the story wasn't about the entertainer. It was about the man, the husband standing beside his wife, the father standing beside his children, the son-in-law saying goodbye to someone who had become part of his own family story. Harvey publicly honored Bridges after his death, reflecting on his faith, fatherhood, and the example he had set. Marjorie also publicly thanked Steve for his support during the painful moment, while their daughter Lori shared her own grief over losing her grandfather. And that is where everything starts to become more personal. Because when Steve Harvey talks about family, he isn't speaking from a distance. He's speaking as someone who has already experienced the enormous transformation that comes with age. He knows what it means to start with almost nothing. He knows what it means to lose years chasing a dream. He knows what it means to finally get everything you wanted. And now he is being reminded that none of it stops the clock. The television cameras can keep rolling. The audience can keep laughing. The suits can keep getting sharper. The career can keep moving. But eventually, every person has to confront the same question. What matters when the spotlight isn't there? And for Steve Harvey, the answer may have been sitting beside him all along: family. But the relationship between Harvey and Marjorie's father reveals something even more powerful. Because Pop Bridges wasn't simply another relative in the family. He had become a man Harvey deeply respected. And what Harvey said about him after his death reveals just how much that relationship meant. For Steve Harvey, the word family has never been just something he says when the cameras are on. It is woven into almost every chapter of his life. And perhaps that is why the loss that struck his family in June 2026 carried a weight that went far beyond the usual sadness of losing a relative. James A. Bridges Sr. was Marjorie Harvey's father. But after Steve married Marjorie in 2007, that relationship gradually became something much deeper. Steve did not publicly describe him simply as his father-in-law. He called him Pop Bridges. And when Harvey finally spoke about his death, those two words seemed to explain everything. On June 5th, Harvey shared the news publicly after the family had laid Bridges to rest. He wrote that they had buried one of the best men he had ever met, identifying Bridges as Marjorie's father, but adding that, to him, he was Pop Bridges. Harvey then thanked him for the example he had provided through faith, fatherhood, and family. That is a remarkably simple message. But sometimes the simplest words carry the most weight. There was no long explanation, no attempt to turn grief into entertainment, no elaborate statement designed to create headlines. Just a man acknowledging that someone important was gone. And that is what makes this moment so revealing. Because Steve Harvey has spent decades teaching audiences how to laugh at uncomfortable situations. He can take an awkward contestant answer on Family Feud and turn it into a moment millions of people remember. He can walk onto a stage and command attention almost instantly. But grief does not work that way. There is no punchline that fixes it. There is no clever comeback. There is no television audience waiting to applaud. There is only the empty space left behind when someone you love is no longer there. James Bridges Sr. died on June 1, 2026, at the age of 91. The news became public through the Harvey family's tributes, with Steve speaking about the man not simply as a relative, but as someone whose example had mattered to him personally. And that distinction matters. Because when a family loses an elderly parent, the grief is rarely confined to one person. It spreads. It reaches children who suddenly realize they will never hear that voice again. It reaches grandchildren who lose someone connected to their earliest memories. And it reaches spouses who are forced to watch the person they love mourn the loss of a parent. For Marjorie, this was the loss of her father. For Steve, it was the loss of the man he had come to call Pop. And for their children and grandchildren, it was another piece of the family's history disappearing. That is the difficult reality of growing older. The people who once seemed permanent aren't permanent. The people who were there when you were young eventually become memories. And Steve Harvey, despite everything he has accomplished, is not immune to that reality. In fact, his own story makes the moment even more poignant. Harvey came from a family where faith and hard work were central. His father was a coal miner, while his mother worked as a Sunday school teacher. Those early influences became part of the foundation upon which Harvey built his own philosophy about life. So when he described Bridges as an example of faith, fatherhood, and family, he was highlighting values that already meant something deeply personal to him. Maybe that is why the tribute feels less like a celebrity announcement and more like a son-in-law saying goodbye to a father figure. And there is another layer. Steve and Marjorie didn't simply create a marriage. They created a blended family. Marjorie brought 3 children into the marriage: Morgan, Jason, and Lori, and Steve became their stepfather and later adopted them. Together, Steve and Marjorie have built a family that includes 7 children and grandchildren as well. That family structure means relationships like the one between Steve and Pop Bridges can become complicated in the best possible way. You don't have to share someone's blood to become part of their family. You don't have to grow up under the same roof to become a father figure. Sometimes a relationship develops slowly. A marriage brings 2 families together. Children connect those families. Years of holidays, conversations, celebrations, arguments, victories, and ordinary days create something that eventually becomes impossible to describe with a simple title. Father-in-law, stepfather, grandfather. Those words can describe a relationship. They cannot always describe the bond. And Steve's choice to call James Bridges Pop suggests that the relationship had moved beyond formal labels. That is also why Marjorie's own response mattered. Following her father's death, she publicly expressed appreciation for Steve's support during the difficult period. Their daughter Lori Harvey also shared her grief and memories of her grandfather. For a family that lives under an enormous amount of public attention, these moments are intensely personal. Every photograph can become a headline. Every sentence can be analyzed. Every emotional post can spread far beyond the people it was originally intended for. Yet the Harvey family still chose to share parts of their grief. Perhaps because grief has a strange way of reminding even famous people that they are not alone. Fans who had spent years watching Steve make them laugh suddenly found themselves watching him mourn. And instead of seeing the television personality, they were seeing a husband, a father, a grandfather, a man who had just said goodbye to someone he respected. That contrast is important, because the public Steve Harvey is built around confidence. The private Steve Harvey has spent years talking about vulnerability, faith, family, mistakes, forgiveness, and purpose. Those 2 versions of him are not necessarily opposites. They are 2 sides of the same person. The comedian is the part the world sees. The family man is the part that has to live with everything after the cameras stop. And at 69, that second side becomes harder to ignore. Harvey has reached an age where the meaning of legacy changes. When you're 20, legacy feels impossibly far away. When you're 40, there is still time to build. But as you approach 70, the question becomes more immediate. What will remain? The television shows? The awards? The jokes? The businesses? The money? Or the people you helped? The children you raised? The grandchildren who remember you? The lessons you passed down? That may be why Harvey's tribute to Pop Bridges feels so significant. He didn't focus on wealth. He didn't focus on fame. He didn't focus on accomplishments. He focused on faith, fatherhood, family, 3 things that cannot be measured by ratings or bank accounts. And perhaps without realizing it, Harvey was describing the kind of legacy he wants for himself. Not simply the man who made America laugh, but the man who showed up for his family. The man who kept going when he had nothing. The man who built something from struggle. The man who understood that eventually all the applause disappears. And when it does, what remains are the relationships. That is the part of Steve Harvey's story that audiences rarely see. For years, people have watched him build an enormous career. But behind that career is a man who has experienced the same ordinary fears as everyone else. Losing people. Growing older. Watching children become adults. Watching grandchildren grow. Realizing that time cannot be stopped. And now, the death of Pop Bridges has placed all of those realities directly in front of him. The heartbreaking part is not simply that Steve Harvey lost someone he loved. It is that moments like this force a person to confront the one thing success can never protect them from: the passage of time. Because Harvey can still step onto a television set. He can still make an audience laugh. He can still host Family Feud. He can still build businesses and speak to millions. But he cannot turn the clock backward. He cannot recreate yesterday. And he cannot bring Pop Bridges back. That realization makes his tribute feel even more powerful. Because behind the famous smile is a man who knows exactly how much life can change. And perhaps the biggest question isn't what Steve Harvey lost in June 2026. It's what this loss may cause him to value even more from this point forward. Because when a man who has spent his entire adult life chasing success begins looking backward, the definition of success can change completely. And the next part of Steve Harvey's story may reveal exactly what he believes is worth holding on to now. On June 1, 2026, Steve Harvey's family experienced a loss that had nothing to do with television ratings, business deals, or the entertainment industry. James A. Bridges Sr., Marjorie Harvey's father and the man Steve affectionately called Pop Bridges, died at the age of 91. 4 days later, Steve publicly shared the news with his followers, revealing that the family had buried him the previous day. For a man whose career has been built around finding the funny side of almost anything, there was no joke here. There was only gratitude. Harvey described Bridges as one of the best men he had ever met and thanked him for being an example of faith, fatherhood, and family. Those words are important because Steve could have focused on almost anything. He could have talked about how successful Bridges was. He could have listed accomplishments. He could have spoken about the family's public profile. Instead, he chose 3 things that sound almost ordinary: faith, fatherhood, family. And in doing so, Steve Harvey revealed what he believed mattered most about the man he was saying goodbye to. Think about the timing. At 69, Harvey was still very much in the middle of his professional life. He remained the host audiences knew from Family Feud, while Celebrity Family Feud was continuing into its 2026 season. ABC confirmed that the show's new season premiered July 9th with Harvey still at the center of the franchise. So while one part of his life was continuing almost exactly as audiences expected, another part had suddenly changed forever. That contrast can be brutal. The television schedule doesn't stop because someone dies. Contracts don't disappear. Production doesn't necessarily pause. Audiences still expect the same energy, the same smile, the same jokes, the same Steve Harvey they've been watching for years. But grief doesn't care about a production schedule. It follows you onto the set. It sits with you in the car. It appears when you wake up. And sometimes, it arrives in the quietest moments, when there is no audience around to distract you. That may be one reason Harvey's short tribute carried so much emotional weight. There was no attempt to pretend the loss wasn't painful. Instead, he honored the man by describing what he represented: faith, fatherhood, family. And those themes happen to be deeply connected to Harvey's own public philosophy. For decades, he has spoken about the importance of perseverance and faith, especially when discussing the years when he was struggling to establish himself as a comedian. His official biography emphasizes his journey from difficult beginnings to entertainment success, and his continued focus on family and mentorship. So perhaps losing Pop Bridges didn't simply mean losing a relative. It meant losing someone who represented a set of values Steve Harvey himself has spent decades trying to pass forward. That is what makes certain losses different. You don't just lose a person. You lose their voice, their advice, their presence at family gatherings, their stories, the small traditions nobody outside the family understands. And eventually, you realize that an entire generation of memories is attached to that person. For Marjorie, the loss was even more immediate. This was her father, the man whose life existed long before she became known as Steve Harvey's wife. The man whose family history helped shape the woman Harvey eventually married. And when someone loses a parent, there are often layers of grief that outsiders cannot see. You mourn the person who died, but you also mourn the conversations you will never have, the questions you never got to ask, the ordinary moments you assumed would continue. That is why grief can feel so strange. You can know someone lived a long life. You can understand that 91 years is a remarkable amount of time. You can be grateful for everything they gave their family, and still feel completely heartbroken when they are gone. Steve's tribute seemed to recognize exactly that complexity. He wasn't simply saying goodbye to an elderly man. He was thanking a person who had made an impact on his life. And the family did not keep the moment entirely private. Marjorie also acknowledged her father's passing and thanked Steve for supporting her through the loss. Their family's public tributes showed that this wasn't something being experienced by Steve alone. It was a moment affecting an entire family network. That matters because Steve Harvey's public image can sometimes make people forget how ordinary some parts of his life really are. Yes, he is wealthy. Yes, he is famous. Yes, millions of people recognize him. But when someone you love dies, none of those things change the fundamental experience. You still miss them. You still have memories. You still have to wake up the next morning and realize they're gone. And eventually, you have to continue living. For Harvey, continuing meant returning to the world his audience knows. Television, entertainment, work, and that creates a powerful image. The same man who was grieving a beloved family member was still the host audiences were watching. Still standing under studio lights. Still delivering answers. Still reacting to contestants. Still making people laugh. That doesn't mean he wasn't hurting. It means life often requires people to carry two realities at the same time. Publicly, Steve Harvey could still be Steve Harvey. Privately, he was a husband supporting his wife and a family member mourning Pop Bridges. And maybe that's something viewers can understand more deeply than any celebrity scandal. Because grief is one of the few experiences that can make a superstar feel completely ordinary. It strips away the titles, the money, the fame, the accomplishments, and leaves behind the person. At 69, Harvey has already lived several lifetimes professionally. He went from a struggling comedian to television star, from television star to businessman, from entertainer to mentor, from comedian to one of the most recognizable hosts in the world. But moments like this force a different kind of accounting. Not financial accounting, personal accounting. Who was there? Who helped you? Who believed in you? Who shaped your values? Who will you miss when they're gone? And perhaps most importantly, what kind of person are you becoming for the people who will one day remember you? That last question may be the most powerful part of Steve Harvey's tribute. Because when he praised Pop Bridges for faith, fatherhood, and family, he was describing qualities that can survive a person's death. A television show eventually ends. A career eventually slows down. A business can be sold. Money can disappear. Fame can move to someone else. But the way a person loved their family can remain for generations. That may be the real legacy Harvey was honoring. And there is something quietly heartbreaking about realizing that the man who built his career making millions of strangers laugh is now entering a period of life where saying goodbye becomes more common. Not because something is necessarily wrong with him. Not because his career is over. But because time moves in only one direction. Steve Harvey is still working. Still appearing on television. Still hosting Celebrity Family Feud in 2026. But the death of Pop Bridges is a reminder that the people surrounding him won't all remain forever. And that changes the meaning of time. Maybe that's the real story behind what happened to Steve Harvey at 69. He didn't suddenly become unrecognizable. He didn't disappear from television. He didn't lose everything. Something much quieter happened. He was reminded that even after achieving almost everything he once dreamed about, there are some things success cannot protect you from. The passage of time, the loss of loved ones, and the realization that the people you love are ultimately more valuable than everything you spent your life trying to build. But there is still one question left. If Steve Harvey's greatest achievements aren't the television shows, the money, or the fame, then what does he actually want his legacy to be? Because the answer may have been hiding in the very words he chose to say goodbye. There comes a point in life when success stops being about what you can achieve and starts being about what you will leave behind. For Steve Harvey, 6'9" may be bringing him closer to that realization. After decades of building a career that seemed almost impossible when he was younger, Harvey has reached a stage where his accomplishments are already undeniable. He went from struggling comedian to television star, from living through financial hardship to becoming one of the most recognizable hosts in America. Yet in June 2026, the death of James A. Bridges Sr., Marjorie Harvey's father, whom Steve affectionately called Pop Bridges, offered a painful reminder that no amount of success can stop time. When Harvey publicly honored Bridges, he didn't focus on money, fame, or accomplishments. Instead, he remembered him through three simple ideas: faith, fatherhood, and family. That choice says a lot. Steve Harvey has spent most of his adult life surrounded by things people associate with success: television shows, business ventures, awards, fame, millions of viewers. But when someone important to him died, none of those things mattered. What mattered was the kind of man Bridges had been. And perhaps that's because Harvey is beginning to look at his own life through the same lens. When you're young, you measure success by how far you can go. You want the career. You want the money. You want people to know your name. Harvey achieved all of those things. But eventually, another question becomes more important. What will the people closest to you remember about you? That question becomes especially powerful for someone who has spent decades talking publicly about faith, perseverance, family, and purpose. Harvey and Marjorie have built a large blended family, and family has remained one of the most important parts of Harvey's public and private identity. Their children and grandchildren represent something that no television show or business can replace. And when Marjorie's father died, Steve wasn't simply watching a family member disappear. He was watching his wife lose her father. Sometimes love means knowing there is nothing you can say to make someone's pain disappear, and staying beside them anyway. That may be one of the quietest lessons hidden inside this tragedy. You can't fix every loss. You can't prevent every goodbye. But you can be present. And perhaps that is what matters more as Harvey gets older. At 69, his career is still moving forward. He continues to be associated with Family Feud, while Celebrity Family Feud remains part of his television life. So this isn't necessarily a story about a man whose career is ending. It's about a man whose perspective may be changing. The younger Steve Harvey had to fight for survival. He had to keep going when opportunities were scarce. He had to believe in himself when there was little evidence that his dream would work. That determination eventually transformed his life. But grief teaches a completely different lesson. You can't outwork it. You can't buy your way around it. You can't negotiate with time. When someone is gone, they are gone. And suddenly, the moments you still have with the people around you become more valuable. That may be the real meaning behind Harvey's tribute to Pop Bridges. He was honoring a man whose legacy was measured not by celebrity, but by character. And perhaps, without intending to, Harvey was also revealing the kind of legacy he wants for himself. Not simply to be remembered as the man who made America laugh, but as a husband, a father, a grandfather, a mentor, a man who survived difficult beginnings and used his success to help others. A man who understood that the people standing beside you matter more than the people watching you. Because eventually every career ends. Every television season concludes. Every spotlight goes dark. But family memories can continue for generations. That is the strange thing about getting older. You begin to understand that time is more valuable than almost everything you once chased. Another conversation, another family dinner, Another birthday. Another ordinary afternoon that doesn't seem important until you realize how quickly those ordinary moments become memories. Steve Harvey has spent his life building an extraordinary career. But perhaps his greatest challenge now isn't building something bigger. It's appreciating what he already has. And that is why the loss of Pop Bridges feels like more than a sad family event. It is a reminder of where Harvey is in his life. The laughter can continue. The cameras can keep rolling. The suits can remain sharp. The audience can keep cheering. But behind all of it is a man who has now been reminded, once again, that time doesn't care how successful you become. And perhaps that is the most emotional part of Steve Harvey's story at 69. He has already proven that he can build a life from almost nothing. Now he has to decide what parts of that life are worth carrying forward. If his tribute to Pop Bridges is any indication, the answer is clear. Faith, family, love, and the people who remain when the applause disappears. Because in the end, Steve Harvey may not be remembered most for the jokes he told or the television shows he hosted. He may be remembered for the lives he touched when nobody was watching. And perhaps that is the legacy that matters most.